Good morning, friends, and welcome to the main object big book study of Alcoholics Anonymous. I am an alcoholic. My name's David. It's good to be with you once again. And one more time, I'm going to ask our friend, well, not one more time, but I will ask our friend Michelle to read the preamble for us.
Hey, good morning. I'm Michelle, alcoholic. This is the AA preamble. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of people who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is the desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution. Does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics achieve sobriety.
Michelle, thank you so much. And now I'm going to ask everybody to join me in inviting God into this meeting this morning by joining together to recite the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. As most of you know, we are a line-by-line big book study, and what we do is we break the text down. We go line by line from the beginning to the end, and we break the text down into 5 categories, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and those are questions, directions and explanations, promises, warnings, and history. And then the colors are corresponding to highlighter colors that I use. And what that does by highlighting the text in those colors, it provides sort of a guide. And I think at some point during the meeting, Rich will post in the chat those categories, so don't worry if you missed it. And so having the text highlighted in that way helps me personally navigate the text, understand it, absorb it, and most importantly, share it with newcomers and other folks. So as we go through today, I'll be talking about that. And our format is we're going to focus on a small bit of text today, and as we do normally. And starting at, we're on page 25, we're near the bottom of the page, picking up where we left off last week. And then we are going to jump to the back of the book and do the spiritual experience, Appendix 2, and depending upon which edition you're using, that could be on page 567, 568, 569. It's somewhere around there. So, and what I will do this morning, I'll talk till about 7 o'clock or so, and then we'll open it up for questions, comments, so forth. In addition, the meeting is being recorded, but don't worry, your comments will not be recorded. However, we do that so we can post the meetings. We can keep an archive on YouTube, and that link will be in the chat as well. And last, I also wanted to mention that for those of you who attend our Tuesday night meditation meeting, just as a general heads up, that Zoom code has recently changed, and we'll be posting the new code. Rich, I have that. I'll post it a little later on. The new code will be in the chat, and that changed because we changed Zoom accounts, but everything else about the meeting is the same. So for now, let's look at the bottom of page 25, and I'm just going to sort of also offer a summary, start off by offering a summary of where we are and what we're doing. So far in what we've read, we've seen that Bill has really driven home the point that as alcoholics, we are unable to stay sober through our own self will, determination, intellect. If we are to stay sober and live happy, successful lives, we need to make a thorough commitment without reservation to something bigger than ourselves. As Bill points out, that something is a spiritual experience or awakening. And Appendix 2 added, which was added to the big book, Appendix 2 was not in the first printing of the first edition in 1939. It was added 2 years later in the second printing, 1941. But the spiritual experience appendix serves to explain that the spiritual experience, unlike what Bill experienced, can often be a gradual change. Because, of course, as we remember, Bill had this sudden, very dramatic awakening, opening up. I mentioned earlier that I spent a lot of time going down various detective rabbit holes this week with this text, because when I looked a little closer at Appendix 2, what I found is that it was also an attempt on Bill's part to address a growing, I guess you would call it split or conflict in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that was between those individuals who strongly believed that a complete spiritual surrender was the only way to stay sober. And those folks were, for the most part, based in the Dr. Bob's Akron group, which was deeply religious. Yet on the East Coast, you had alcoholics who were agnostic or atheist, and those folks found sobriety and usefulness through reliance upon their fellow alcoholics. So what we'll see is that what Bill attempts to do in the appendix is bring people together in such a way. He does it subtly. So anyway, let's jump to the bottom of page 25. Most of this paragraph, just so that you know, except for the last line, basically, I have that highlighted in pink for a warning. And it starts out, if you are as seriously alcoholic as we were, we believe there is no middle of the road solution. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible. And if we passed into the region from which there is no return through human aid, we had but two alternatives. One was to go to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of our intolerable situation as best we could. And the other was to accept spiritual help. Now, that last part, the other was to accept spiritual help, you can highlight that however you want, of course. You may consider that still part of the warning. I actually put it as a promise, or I don't know, if you're more a promise than a reward, I guess, but I have it in blue. Or you could also even put it as green. I mean, I don't want to, forgive me if I'm confusing people. It's really whatever feels best or most right to you. But I want to just touch back a second here and focus on the general message Bill's trying to convey in this paragraph. And he's really talking about either a spiritual or emotional mindset, or kind of where we're at when we get sober, or what it takes to get sober. And he's talking about no middle of the road solution. And he's talking about life becoming impossible. And I can share from my own experience, I've run the gamut with that notion of life becoming impossible, especially when working with other people. Um, and what I mean by that is that there are a lot of reasons that people come into Alcoholics Anonymous. As I shared in my own story, I mean, I got here because, you know, the state of New Jersey thought it would be in everybody's best interest if I started attending Alcoholics Anonymous. And even though in some aspects my life was impossible, the only problem was I was not aware of that. I was living in reaction to that, and but not fully owning or accepting that fact. So as a consequence, I did not take the program seriously at first. I thought I was sort of above it all. And over the years, what I have found is that I have attempted to, people ask you to be their sponsor and so forth. And what I've found is that the difference between, if some people have probably experienced this, you'll sponsor people who are like absolutely all in and everything, they're putting everything on the table and they'll do whatever suggestion you give them. And there are some that they ask you to be their sponsor and then they enter the witness protection program. Like you never see them again. And so generally, like, what's the difference between these two types of sponsees? And what I found is that notion of, for the one that's willing to do everything, they really are at a place where life is impossible for them. And think about that for a second. It doesn't just mean life is hard or life is difficult or drinking's creating difficulties. It's that there's absolutely no way to go on. They can't envision life with alcohol and they can't envision life without it. That's what it means for life to be impossible. And on the other end, what I have tried to do is I've tried to force feed the program to people who, for them, for whatever reason, their life was not impossible. Drinking was a real nuisance. Drinking was a real difficulty. It was a real pain. But they weren't to the point, they still had options. Now, that said, as a sponsor, as someone helping other people, I've also gone to extremes with that. And I've become angry and intolerant with people who haven't been willing to admit or say the words, in some form that life is impossible. But what I found is that there are, over the years, I've sort of gotten a little bit more pragmatic about it and not so much softened, but become more realistic about it. And that is, there are some people for whom their entire life is not impossible, but certain aspects are. And then there are people whose life is just not impossible, but they're here for some other reason. Typically, they may not be willing or able to work the steps as they are written. That's okay, but what's important is for me to know that and to be loving and tolerant of all of them. And I think, what's the quick formula to figure that out? I don't know. It's just taken me time. And so I think that's important. And I think it's important that I think if we are going to have happy, contented sobriety, that we do need to reach a point where there is no middle of the road solution. Some of us, just like I just explained, some of us come to that right out of the gate, and some of us come to it over time. I was an overtime person. So moving on. So we're talking about accepting spiritual help. And then this last paragraph I have in green as a explanation or direction. This we did because we honestly wanted to and were willing to make the effort. So again, giving you a picture of the mindset that is necessary in order to adopt this way of life successfully. And now let's jump to the back of the book, Appendix 2. And as I mentioned earlier, this was not in the first printing, first edition. This was added 2 years later, 1941. And it was added because what was happening at that time was that there was a growing rift in Alcoholics Anonymous, I should say, a tension. And that tension was between the people who were deeply immersed in the spiritual journey. And then there were those people, and for the most part, you can see this when you read, for instance, about if you ever were to read Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, and how Dr. Bob sponsored people, and complete spiritual surrender on your knees. You know, he would have sponsees do it in his office, in his doctor's office. Now, on the East Coast, what you had were people like a guy named Hank P., or today he's known as Hank Parkhurst, adamant atheist, and who was responsible for the inclusion of the term God as we understand him. Bill wrote it, but Hank said, "You got to do something, Bill, because I'm not buying all this God stuff." And so you had voices saying you absolutely needed a spiritual surrender, and then you had voices saying, and you sometimes hear it today, all you need to do is not drink and go to meetings and hang with other alcoholics. And so that is not a new mindset. That was in AA from the beginning. And let's see what Bill does in order to sort of bring those two camps together. The terms, and most of these first 1, 2, 3, the first 3 paragraphs here I have in green as directions or explanations. The terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are used many times in this book, which upon careful reading shows that the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself among us in many different forms. And this right here, we see a shift in Bill's thinking. Remember that when Bill first got sober, what was he doing? He was going around pulling drunks off of Skid Row and telling them they must have the kind of spiritual conversion he had with Ebby, or that Carl Jung is talking about with Roland Hazard. And of course, Dr. Silkworth helped him to temper that point of view, but so this is a shift for Bill. Bill is really opening his mind to different approaches here. Yet it is true that our first printing gave many readers the impression that these personality changes or religious experiences must be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheavals. Happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. In the first few chapters, a number of sudden revolutionary changes are described. Though it was not our intention to create such an impression, many alcoholics have nevertheless concluded that in order to recover, they must acquire an immediate and overwhelming God consciousness, followed at once by a vast change in feeling and outlook. Now, in this next paragraph here, the first 2 sentences I have in green for explanations. Among our rapidly growing membership of thousands of alcoholics, such transformations, though frequent, are by no means the rule. Most of our experiences are what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, because they develop slowly over time. And I could say that in my own case, I had one of those immediate awakenings. However, I also had an educational experience. And what I mean by that is I was sitting in someplace my friend Robbie knows really well. I was sitting in the hut on Oak Avenue, September 11th, 1988. A gentleman named Bill was Bill. I'll say his last name because he's passed on. Eddie, or excuse me, Robbie remembers him. Bill Webb was chairing the fourth step meeting. I had a blow the doors off white light experience that immediately relieved me of the desire to drink and immediately instilled in me the desire to be an active participating member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the desire to drink has never returned since then. However, I was still crazier than a bedbug. And so I integrated that spiritual experience right into my obsessive sense of self-centeredness. And it took me a lot of education in AA to actually live the spirituality, that God graced me with that first day, if that makes sense. So anyway, the other thing that I want to point out is, and I'm not going to really dwell on this, but I put links in the chat, or Rich did, to dive deeper into what William James actually wrote, and versus what Bill wrote. Actually, and I'll just touch on it briefly. What I found is that William James actually never said, use the term educational variety. However, William James, in Varieties of Religious Experience, did make the point that spiritual changes or spiritual awakenings can be gradual. And so what Bill really does is he summarizes, he leans on William James, but that direct quote you won't find from William James. Now, I understand what Bill was trying to do, because at that point I think there was a hint of desperation in his writing, like, I've got to pull these people together. Let me lean on some authority here and summarize the idea, and I'll use it as a quote. So I don't fault Bill for that. So moving on, this next sentence, the one that begins quite often, I have that as a promise or a reward, so it's in blue. Quite often, friends of the newcomer are aware of the difference long before he is himself. He finally realizes that he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life, that such a change could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. And I think what Bill is doing there is he is really trying to create a common bond between the people who believe in the who are the staunch spiritualist, you would say, or the spiritually oriented people, and the people who are more fellowship oriented, because both experiences can happen where that gradual change takes place if you're rooted in the fellowship and if you're rooted in spirituality. And then the next sentence I have as both a promise and a direction. What often takes place in a few months could seldom have been accomplished by years of self-discipline. with few, and then the next sentence, let's see, what have I got here? The rest of this paragraph I have in blue as a promise. With few exceptions, our members find that they have tapped an unsuspected inner resource, which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. So you will sometimes hear people say, GOD, group of drunks. And I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, my thinking continues to evolve in that way. For a long time, even though I professed this huge sort of spiritual experience, when you looked at how I conducted myself in AA and how my mindset, really I was staying sober through meetings and the fellowship. Okay? And then I had more of a thorough spiritual experience. But then I became a little intolerant, saying that the spiritual experience was the quote-unquote real AA. And if you're staying sober on the fellowship, well, that's good for now, but, come on, get with the program here. And especially reading what Bill went through here, here's what I know, is that today there are members with many decades of useful, contented sobriety who have stayed sober through fellowship-based spirituality. Let's put it that way. And there are those who have developed very deep and profound spiritual connections with a God of their own understanding. And today, I don't look at it as right versus wrong. I look at it as, and this is just me, I look at it as left-handed versus right-handed. You have left-handed alcoholics, you have right-handed alcoholics. Which is better than which one's the better one? It doesn't matter. It's the way that God takes us on our journey. So, again, and then this sentence, forgive me if I said this already, this is in green. For direction, most of us think this awareness of a power greater than ourselves is the essence of a spiritual experience. Our more religious members call it God consciousness. And then I've got double highlights with green and blue, directions and promise. Most emphatically, we wish to say that any alcoholic capable of honestly facing his problems in the light of our experience can recover, provided he does not close his mind to all spiritual concepts. And I think what Bill is doing here, he is closing out this appendix by taking these two strands and weaving them together and basically saying, whatever your belief, whether you're deeply spiritual or deeply fellowship oriented, here's what we can agree on. And then this last, in this paragraph here, I have this in pink for a warning. He can only be defeated by an attitude of intolerance or belligerent denial. And I think there again, regardless of your orientation, we can agree on that. We find that no one need have difficulty with the spirituality of the program. That's a promise or a reward. And then a direction. Willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are essentials of recovery, but these are indispensable. Now, I understood what he was saying, but I always question, why did he put that there? And then I realized what he was trying to do by reconciling these two camps. He's trying to reconcile these two camps. So what he's saying in italics there, because he's really trying to punch it by putting it in italics, is, gang, no matter where you are, we can agree on this, correct? And that he uses to bind these people together, because Bill desperately wanted unity throughout the fellowship. And then closing it out, there is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. There is a link in the chat about this quote that's attributed to Herbert Spencer, sort of like the William James quote, but even more so. What I found, to my surprise, even though edition after edition of the Big Book has printed the name Herbert Spencer there, Herbert Spencer did not say this. It is attributed in a different form to an English philosopher named William Paley. Is that really important? I think it doesn't. I think it doesn't matter. I think the general principle is what's important. How it got there, just as a bit of history, is that in the first edition of the book, there was a story called The Artist's Concept by a gentleman who actually designed the cover for the Big Book, who was also an alcoholic, whose story was also in the book. He put that quote, attributing it to Herbert Spencer, at the beginning of his story. Then, with the second edition of the book, the story got removed. But Bill liked the quote so much that he tacked it onto the end of the spiritual experience. And that's where it stayed ever since. So that's the story there. So anyway, moving on, I'm a little past my time. I just want to mention I posted 3 questions for reflection, as I normally do. So you can take these for discussion today, or anything that I've talked about, or anything in the text that we've read. But think about this. When I got sober, was it the case that life was becoming impossible for me? If so, how? And then, what was the spiritual experience or spiritual awakening? What has that been like for me? And then lastly, how have willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness influenced my spiritual journey? And how have these qualities challenged me? And with that, let's open it up.